Welcome back to Hopeful Horizon, where we share stories that touch the heart and open the mind. Today's story is one of dignity, resilience, and a son's fight for justice when his own mother is unfairly targeted by those sworn to protect her. It begins with a simple shopping trip that takes a dark turn when Mildred Carter, a retired teacher in her 70s, finds herself accused of theft by two officers. What they don't know: her son is the city's police commissioner, a man dedicated to reforming the very system his mother now finds herself at odds with. Join us as we uncover the unexpected twists, challenges, and a pursuit of justice that highlights the power of accountability. This story reminds us all of the importance of standing against bias, no matter how deeply rooted. If you're drawn to stories about resilience, courage, and real change, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from. Be sure to subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss another story that inspires and challenges right here on Hopeful Horizon. Mildred Carter held her chin high as she walked out of the small neighborhood grocery store, a modest bag of fruits and vegetables tucked under her arm. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue on the once familiar neighborhood, now transformed by gentrification. New shops with sleek facades stood in contrast to the older, more humble establishments. Mildred had lived in this area for most of her life, witnessing the ebb and flow of change, but she remained a constant, a proud, dignified woman who carried herself with a quiet resilience. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, Mildred's thoughts drifted to the days when the neighborhood was filled with familiar faces. Now, there were more strangers, and with them, an uneasy increase in police patrols. She'd seen officers out in pairs more frequently, especially since the area started attracting new residents. Mildred noted this change with a mixture of curiosity and concern. She couldn't ignore how the gaze of these patrol officers lingered longer on people who looked like her, people who'd called this neighborhood home long before the coffee shops and boutiques arrived. Lost in her thoughts, she didn't immediately notice two officers approaching her from the side. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you," one of them said sharply, snapping her back to the present. Mildred turned to face the officers. Officer Reed, a tall man with a stern expression, held her gaze, while his partner, Officer Stevens, looked slightly uncomfortable, but still stood his ground. Mildred looked at them both, a mixture of curiosity and confusion in her eyes. "Is there a problem, officers?" she asked calmly. "We received a tip about suspicious activity," Officer Reed replied, his voice laced with authority. He didn't look at her as though she were a grandmother who had spent decades teaching children in this very community. Instead, his gaze was cold, scrutinizing, as if she were a stranger who didn't belong. Mildred's eyebrows knit together. "Suspicious activity? I was just doing my grocery shopping." "Would you mind letting us check your bags?" Reed's tone made it clear this wasn't a request, and he extended his hand toward her shopping bag without waiting for permission. Mildred felt her pulse quicken. She took a small step back, clinging tighter to her grocery bag. "I don't see why that's necessary. I haven't done anything wrong." Her voice was steady, but she could feel a knot of frustration tightening in her chest. Mildred had been in this community longer than these young officers had probably been alive. The idea that they would view her with suspicion stung her deeply. She straightened her posture, hoping her dignified stance would convey that she would not be easily intimidated. The small crowd of onlookers that had begun to gather murmured among themselves, some pulling out their phones to record. Mildred could feel their eyes on her, a mixture of pity and curiosity, and it only strengthened her resolve. She looked at Officer Reed, her voice firmer this time. "I assure you, I've done nothing wrong." But Officer Reed wasn't interested in reassurances. He snatched the grocery bag from her arm, his expression growing harder. "If you have nothing to hide, then you shouldn't have any problem with us checking." Mildred's hands trembled, not out of fear, but from anger and indignation. "I will not be treated like this. I demand to speak with your supervisor." "Ma'am, if you don't cooperate, we'll have to take further action," Officer Reed replied with a dismissive glance, ignoring her request. As Reed rummaged through her bag, pulling out the modest items one by one, Mildred felt her sense of dignity being stripped away. She was painfully aware of the crowd watching, of the whispered comments and recording phones, but she held her head high, her resolve unbroken. With one hand trembling, she reached for her phone and dialed her son. The line rang once, then twice, and then his warm, familiar voice answered. "Mom, is everything okay?" Mildred's voice wavered, but she kept it as steady as she could manage. "David, I need you to come. Now." Police Commissioner David Carter was in the middle of a city council meeting when he felt his phone buzz in his pocket. Normally, he wouldn't have answered, but when he saw his mother's name flash across the screen, something told him this wasn't a casual call. Mildred rarely called him during work hours, and when she did, it was never without reason. David excused himself and stepped out into the hallway, pressing the phone to his ear. "Mom, is everything okay?" The sound of his mother's voice on the other end was enough to send a chill down his spine. She sounded rattled, something he hadn't heard in her voice in a long time. "David, I need you to come. Now I'm at the grocery store and I'm being harassed by police officers." David's jaw clenched. He'd heard reports of racial profiling in his precinct, but the thought that his own mother had fallen victim to such treatment was something he could hardly process. He'd worked tirelessly to reform the department, to root out biases and create a force that served every community member fairly. Yet here was proof that his work was far from done. "I'm on my way, Mom. Stay calm. I'll be there soon," he said, his voice tight with a barely restrained fury. As he drove, David's mind raced. His mother, Mildred, was the kind of woman who commanded respect without ever asking for it. She'd raised him to stand up for what was right, to use his position to fight for justice. And now she was facing the very injustice he'd dedicated his career to combating. The weight of this irony was almost unbearable. As he neared the grocery store, he saw a crowd gathered on the sidewalk. People were whispering, pointing, and several held up their phones, recording. His mother was at the center of it all, her face a mask of quiet resilience as the officers continued their search, seemingly oblivious to the growing crowd and her mounting discomfort. David parked quickly and stepped out of his car, his expression unreadable as he approached. His heart ached to see his mother in such a situation, but he forced himself to remain calm, to keep his anger in check. David stopped just on the edge of the crowd, taking in the scene before him. Officer Reed was rummaging through his mother's bag, pulling out each item with a casual disrespect that made David's blood boil. His mother stood tall, her chin raised, but he could see the weariness in her eyes, the indignation she fought to keep contained. "Excuse me," David said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. Both officers turned to look at him, their expressions shifting from smug authority to sudden unease. Reed's eyes flickered with recognition, but he quickly masked it, straightening his posture as he met David's gaze. "Can we help you, sir?" Reed asked, his tone uncertain. David took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the officers. "I'm Police Commissioner David Carter, and you are currently harassing my mother without cause." A hush fell over the crowd, and David could feel the collective intake of breath around him. He could see the shock in Reed's eyes and the realization dawning on Stephen's face as he began to grasp the gravity of the situation. Mildred's eyes softened slightly as she saw her son, but she maintained her composure, not wanting to show vulnerability in front of the crowd. "These officers stopped me, accused me of shoplifting, and proceeded to search me," she said, her voice steady. "They refused to call a supervisor when I asked." David turned his attention back to the officers, his tone icy. "Do you have any explanation for this, officers?" Reed cleared his throat, stammering slightly. We received a tip about suspicious activity." David's gaze bore into him. A tip? From whom? And what exactly was suspicious about an elderly woman carrying groceries? Reed faltered, unable to answer. David took a deep breath, keeping his fury tightly controlled. "Your actions today will have consequences. I'd suggest you both consider what those consequences might be." As David escorted his mother away from the officers, the crowd watched in awe, some whispering words of support for Mildred. David didn't look back at the officers. He knew they'd be dealt with soon enough. The moment they were away from the crowd, David stopped and turned to face his mother, his expression softening. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I never thought." Mildred placed a gentle hand on his arm. You don't have to apologize, David. This is the world we live in, but I'm glad I have a son who's willing to change it. David nodded, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just about his mother. It was about every person who had ever been mistreated, humiliated, and profiled. This was the fight he'd dedicated himself to, and now he was more determined than ever. David sat in his office, his fingers pressed together as he stared at the door. The quiet hum of the precinct felt heavier, more loaded with unspoken tensions. Today, he wasn't just a police commissioner. He was a son, seeking justice for his mother. He could hear the murmur of officers outside, whispers that faded into silence when he looked up. A knock at the door broke his focus. Commissioner Carter? The voice belonged to Captain Lewis from Internal Affairs, a woman known for her rigorous investigations and uncompromising approach. She entered, followed closely by Officer Reed and Officer Stevens, each looking a mixture of anxious and defiant. David gestured for them to sit. Captain Lewis, please start the investigation. Captain Lewis opened her folder, looking sharply at the officers. We've reviewed the preliminary reports, but as per Commissioner Carter's request, we'll go over the body cam footage and individual testimonies. Officer Reed, Officer Stevens, you're each entitled to legal representation, but for now, we're here to understand what happened. Officer Reed's jaw tensed. Ma'am, I was simply acting on a tip about suspicious behavior. We've had incidents of shoplifting in that area. I followed protocol. David leaned forward, his voice steady but loaded. A tip. Can you clarify who gave you this tip and why you thought it necessary to detain a 70-year-old woman based on that alone? Reed shifted uncomfortably. Commissioner, Answer the question, Officer Reed. Captain Lewis interjected firmly, her gaze unwavering. Reed hesitated, glancing at his partner. Stevens looked down, clearly uncomfortable. We didn't receive a formal tip, sir. It was, well, just a pattern we've noticed. A pattern, David repeated, his voice simmering with controlled anger. A pattern that led you to racially profile and publicly humiliate my mother? Silence fell over the room. David's words hung heavy in the air, drawing attention to a truth both officers were reluctant to confront. Captain Lewis paused, then pressed a button to play the body cam footage. The video captured everything, the brusque tone, the dismissal of Mildred's explanations, and even the veiled threats. Watching it, David felt a deep sense of betrayal and anger. As the video played, Officer Stevens' shoulders slumped. I was just following orders, he said, voice barely above a whisper. Reed shot him a sharp look, but David raised a hand. This isn't about following orders. It's about accountability. Each of you swore to uphold justice. How is it just to treat a defenseless woman with such disrespect? The tension was palpable, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then Captain Lewis cleared her throat. Officer Reed, Officer Stevens, this footage makes it clear that your actions were not only unnecessary, but were in direct violation of the department's code of conduct. Commissioner Carter, I'll be launching a full review and internal investigation. David nodded, his gaze fixed on the two officers. This is just the beginning. From this day on, our department will ensure that incidents like this aren't dismissed or ignored. Dismissed. The officers filed out of the room, leaving David and Captain Lewis alone. She studied him, her expression both empathetic and firm. Commissioner, she said softly, you've got a difficult road ahead. David nodded, glancing at the empty chairs. But it's a road we have to take. In the large conference room, department heads, senior officers, and other key members of the precinct filled the seats, murmuring with tension. At the head of the table, David stood, his expression resolute. Today, he wasn't just addressing the issue of his mother's profiling. He was declaring a new direction for the entire department. Thank you all for being here, he began, his voice carrying a gravitas that commanded silence. We're at a critical juncture. The incident with my mother isn't an isolated one. We've ignored these issues too long, and it's eroded the trust our community once had in us. Several officers exchanged glances, some nodding, others visibly uncomfortable. David continued, unwavering. We're implementing new policies, effective immediately. All officers will undergo mandatory bias and de-escalation training. We're also introducing enhanced accountability measures. Every interaction with civilians will be reviewed, and any profiling or discriminatory behavior will face strict repercussions. A hand shot up. It was Lieutenant McCarthy, a veteran officer known for his traditional views. "Sir, with all due respect, this feels extreme. We've had these measures in place for years. I don't see how adding more policies will change anything." David met his gaze, steady and firm. "Lieutenant, our current measures clearly aren't enough. My own mother was profiled by officers in this department. Imagine how many others experience this every day, but don't have a son who can hold those responsible accountable. We're failing to protect the very people we swore to serve." The room fell silent again, McCarthy shifting uncomfortably in his chair. Captain Lewis leaned forward. "Commissioner Carter is right. This isn't about punishing officers. It's about restoring trust. If we don't make these changes, we'll lose any remaining respect from the community." David nodded in agreement. "These reforms aren't just about today. They're about ensuring that the next generation of officers holds themselves to a higher standard. This is about changing a culture that's resisted change for too long." As he finished, a murmur of approval spread through the room. Some officers still looked wary, but many nodded in agreement, seeing the weight of his words. After the meeting, David approached Captain Lewis, who was reviewing notes. "Thank you for your support in there," he said. She smiled. "You're doing the right thing, David. Change is hard, but you're leading the way. This department will be better for it." David felt a surge of gratitude. "Let's hope so. We've got a lot of work ahead of us." A few weeks later, David and his mother, Mildred, walked through the neighborhood, the early afternoon sun casting long shadows on the sidewalk. Their stroll took them past the grocery store, where familiar faces greeted them with warm smiles and nods. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Carter, Commissioner." The store manager waved, gratitude evident in his tone. The viral video had sparked a community-wide discussion, bringing an outpouring of support for Mildred and putting pressure on the precinct to change. Mildred smiled, her eyes crinkling. "Thank you, dear." She leaned toward David as they walked. "I didn't think my little shopping trip would make such a difference." David chuckled, though his eyes held a mixture of pride and determination. "Mom, you were brave. You didn't back down. That video, it woke people up. And it reminded me why I chose this career, to make a difference." As they continued down the street, they saw familiar faces who nodded in respect, a sense of community solidarity palpable in the air. It was as if Mildred's experience had sparked a collective resolve, a newfound vigilance against prejudice and profiling. "David," Mildred began quietly, "do you think this will last? Will the changes you're making really stick?" David paused, considering her words. "I believe so, Mom. We're holding officers accountable, and the community is watching closely now. Change takes time, but we're laying the groundwork. This is just the beginning." They reached the end of the street, where a mural adorned a nearby wall. It was newly painted, depicting diverse members of the community, standing together in unity. At the center was an elderly woman with silver hair, standing tall with dignity. David and Mildred stopped to take in the mural. David's heart swelled with pride, realizing that his mother had become a symbol of resilience, a quiet force for change. "Looks a bit like you, doesn't it?" he said, a soft smile tugging at his lips. Mildred laughed, her eyes misting over. "I suppose it does. But David, this isn't just my story, it's ours, and I'm proud of you for standing up, for fighting to make this a better place." David reached out, taking her hand. "Thank you, Mom, and thank you for showing me what strength and dignity look like." As they walked back, David knew there would still be challenges ahead, but with his mother's unwavering example and a community ready to hold him accountable, he felt hopeful. Together, they had sparked a change, one that would ripple through the department and inspire generations to come. And in that moment, beneath the mural, with the city buzzing around them, they felt the first breath of a new beginning. Thank you for joining us on this journey of resilience, family, and accountability. Mildred and David's story shows us that standing up to injustice isn't just about courage, it's about creating lasting change, even when it's difficult. It reminds us that every voice matters, and sometimes change begins with just one person's experience. If this story inspired you, leave us a comment and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss an impactful story that challenges and uplifts. We'll be back soon with more stories that push boundaries and make a difference. Thank you for being part of our community. Until next time, stay hopeful, stay empowered, and remember that every stand for justice brings us closer to a brighter future.